Today's subject is a woman whose smoky voice, wide eyes, and unflinching presence made her one of the fiercest icons in Hollywood history, Susan Sarandon. She wasn't just a leading lady, she was a force, a disruptor, the kind of actress who didn't play the ingenue, but devoured the frame with moral fire and magnetic rage. From the cult chaos of the Rocky Horror Picture Show to the quiet defiance of Dead Man Walking, Susan didn't just act, she challenged. She challenged the system, the scripts, the roles women were allowed to play, and the politics celebrities were expected to avoid. For decades, she refused to be boxed in. Not by age, not by beauty, not by Hollywood's soft silencing of women who spoke too much and aged too well. But while the spotlight praised her daring and the awards followed her fire, what it rarely captured were the costs. Susan Sarandon's legacy is marked not just by red carpets and golden statues, but by a series of quiet betrayals. Studios that backed away, journalists who turned activists into punchline, and an industry that never fully forgave her for standing firm when silence was safer. She took the hits for her politics, her lovers, her age, and her voice, and kept speaking. She became a mother at 39, raised 3 children outside the traditional frame, and watched the headlines care more about her relationships than her revolution. This is the story of Susan Sarandon, the legend who refused to fade, the woman Hollywood tried to punish for her convictions, and the mother whose most enduring roles weren't always on screen. Eva Amori, she was born into 2 worlds, one Italian, one American, both cinematic, and before she ever stepped onto a set, Eva Amori was already caught between spotlight and legacy. Born on March 15, 1985 in New York City to director Franco Amori and Academy Award-winning actress Susan Sarandon, Eva grew up in a home where scripts were casually strewn across tables and red carpets were just part of the family calendar. But even in childhood, the glamour was mixed with tension. Her parents split not long after her birth, and she spent her early years toggling between New York and Italy, between her mother's fierce independence and her father's artistic distance. It was Susan who raised her day to day, on film sets, political protests, and in the kind of bohemian household where creativity trumped convention. But being the daughter of Susan Sarandon was a double-edged inheritance. The world expected her to be bold, brilliant, original. Anything less would be disappointment. So when Eva made her screen debut in 1992's Bob Roberts, in a small role alongside her mother, it wasn't seen as a debut. It was seen as inevitable. In high school, she tried to carve a path of her own, attending Friends Seminary in Manhattan, then graduating from Brown University with a degree in Italian studies. But Hollywood was always circling. She acted in Saved, 2004, The Banger Sisters, 2002, Californication, and a handful of indie films, often bringing intelligence and edge to the screen. But still, the comparisons were relentless. Critics dismissed her as riding her mother's coattails. Casting directors offered her roles that mirrored her mother's younger archetypes. And gossip columns were less interested in her work than in the woman who raised her. The label Nepo Baby didn't exist in the early 2000s, but Eva lived under it anyway. She once said she felt typecast in life, not just in film. Always someone's daughter, never quite her own person. In her 20s, Eva tried to push back. She moved away from the family name, auditioned anonymously when she could, and launched a lifestyle blog, Happily Eva After, partly as a way to take control of her own story. The blog was an instant success, not because of Hollywood connections, but because it felt honest, about motherhood, about divorce, about anxiety, about privilege. She married soccer commentator Kyle Martino in 2011 and had 3 children, but the marriage unraveled by 2020, a split she handled publicly, gracefully, and with self-awareness that won over even some of her mother's critics. Along the way, Eva quietly redefined herself not as Susan Sarandon's daughter, but as a working mother with a curated voice, balancing the domestic and the digital. Still, the shadow never fully lifted. Anytime she spoke about parenting, trolls resurfaced old photos of her on red carpets with Susan. When she launched brand collaborations, comment sections questioned her real credentials. And when Susan Sarandon herself became a lightning rod for political controversy in the Trump and Bernie Sanders eras, Eva often had to field the public's projection, answering for opinions that weren't hers, caught between defending her mother and preserving her own autonomy. By the time she turned 35, Eva had become something her younger self might not have imagined. Not a movie star, not a rebel, but a steady voice for women navigating identity, legacy, and reinvention. She now splits her time between Connecticut and social media, raising 3 kids and building a digital brand that exists, finally, on its own terms. And while she'll never fully escape the name that got her through the door, she's learned to use it without being used by it. For Eva Amori, the drama wasn't in her roles, it was in the lineage. And the greatest performance she ever gave was one the public almost missed, becoming herself in a world that insisted she could only be someone else's daughter. Jack Henry Robbins was born on May 15, 1989, into a household where cinema was more than entertainment. It was religion. The son of Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins, Jack was raised in a creative crucible, surrounded by actors, directors, and the kind of political conversation most children never overhear. Unlike his older half-sister Eva, who inherited her mother's screen presence, Jack gravitated behind the camera from the start. While Susan fought culture wars on television and Tim challenged studios with subversive scripts, Jack was the quiet observer, sketching, filming, archiving. He wasn't raised with expectations of fame, but he was raised with expectations of impact. His mother taught him that art was a weapon, and his father taught him that satire was sacred. In childhood, he appeared in the background of red carpet photos, often blinking into flashes with a stoicism far older than his years. He watched his parents become Hollywood's most principled power couple, then watched them split, publicly but without scandal, when he was 20. The separation marked him deeply, though he rarely spoke of it. Instead, he turned his attention to building something of his own. At Brown University, Jack studied film and digital media, embracing experimental techniques that mirrored his father's indie sensibilities, but carved a separate lane. By the time he entered his late 20s, he'd become known in underground film circles for his mockumentary style and genre blending, equal parts nostalgia and absurdism. His breakout short opening night played Sundance, and his first feature, VHY's 2019, was a dizzying VHS-airy fever dream that critics couldn't quite categorize but admired for its ambition. It was lo-fi, funny, and laced with the kind of media commentary only someone raised in the belly of Hollywood could write. Still, mainstream recognition remained distant. Jack wasn't interested in celebrity. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, he spoke more about analog equipment than family. But the shadow of Susan Sarandon loomed whether he acknowledged it or not. Whenever she made headlines, whether for a bold political statement, a controversial tweet, or a fiery award speech, Jack's work was quietly recontextualized by the press as the son of Sarandon gets weird with tape again. He wasn't dismissive of her influence, but he didn't exploit it either. Their relationship, by all accounts, was close, built on mutual respect, shared politics, and a trust that came from surviving the same cultural machine. But there was distance, too. While Susan thrived in confrontation, Jack hid in form. While she sought the stage, he kept to the cutting room. As social media began to reshape the landscape of film promotion, Jack stayed offline, allergic to branding. He chose short films over studio deals, documentaries over blockbusters, and continued to explore how memory and media shaped human identity. In a quieter era, he might have been seen as a visionary. In this one, he remained something more elusive. A Robbins without the Robbins drama, a Sarandon who left the screen behind. Today, Jack Henry Robbins works steadily from the fringes of Hollywood, directing content for Adult Swim and producing shorts that blur the line between comedy and critique. He has no scandals, no viral outbursts, no tabloid trail. His rebellion is restraint, And in a family defined by loud convictions and louder performances, Jack's voice is clearest in silence, in analog whirs, awkward zooms, and final cuts. He may never fill a theater, but he's building a catalog that speaks for itself, one tape at a time. Miles Guthrie Robbins was born on May 4, 1992, the youngest of Susan Sarandon's three children and the second son of her decades-long partnership with actor-director Tim Robbins. Arriving at a time when both his parents were at the peak of their careers and the pressure of legacy was already a silent presence in the nursery. Unlike Eva, who was cast in the public eye early, or Jack, who avoided it altogether, Miles grew up with a kind of spectral fame, known before he had a chance to define himself. Photographed on red carpets as a toddler, whispered about in gossip pages simply because of his last name. But where his siblings sought structured spaces, film school, lifestyle branding, Miles moved like water, elusive, protean, and often surprising. He was raised in an environment that celebrated freedom of thought, gender expression, and radical politics, which he embraced and subverted in equal measure. By the time he was a teenager, it was clear that Miles didn't just inherit his parents' talent, he inherited their defiance. In high school, he shaved half his head, wore dresses, and fronted a psychedelic rock band called The Tangents, performing under the stage name MF Ruckus. His look was part glam, part goth, part provocation, and while the media scrambled to define him as a gender-bending performer, Miles kept pushing. He wasn't trying to be shocking. He was trying to be ungovernable. His relationship with Susan was reportedly close, though never performative. While she made headlines for her political stances, Miles made noise in dive bars and underground scenes, often fielding lazy headlines like Sarandon's son wears gown on a stage with a smirk and a shrug. But he wasn't just experimenting, he was working. After a few small acting roles in his 20s, his breakout came with the 2018 slasher reboot Halloween, where he played the lovable, awkward boyfriend Dave, a character so charming that fans were genuinely upset by his brutal on-screen death. That same year, he starred in Blockers, The Day Shall Come, and most notably, Daniel Isn't Real, a psychological horror film in which he delivered a performance that was layered, unsettling, and emotionally raw. Critics began to pay attention. They described him as magnetic, versatile, able to move from comedy to horror to drama with ease. But just as his profile began to rise, Miles pulled back. He didn't chase franchises or endorsements. Instead, he drifted toward art house projects, focusing on roles that dealt with identity, mental illness, and metaphysical trauma. In interviews, he came across as thoughtful but wary, aware of how easily the press could reduce him to a celebrity child doing weird roles. He rejected that framing completely. Unlike Eva, who had to wrestle with comparisons to her mother's physicality, or Jack, who battled to escape his father's shadow behind the camera, Miles seemed determined to dismantle the very idea of expectation. He was the child who didn't ask for the spotlight, but knew how to use it as a mirror, reflecting back the absurdity of Hollywood's hunger for labels. Still, the burden of lineage never vanished. Whenever Susan Sarandon courted controversy, whether for her anti-establishment politics, her defense of Bernie Sanders, or her unapologetic aging, the spotlight inevitably flickered toward Miles. Trolls tried to use his androgyny as proof of her Hollywood decay, while supporters held him up as a new kind of masculinity. Through it all, Miles stayed characteristically Miles, hard to pin down, harder to ignore. Today he works in both music and film, choosing projects slowly, living in creative spurts rather than press cycles. He's private but not reclusive, political but not predictable. And while his mother's voice still echoes in the rooms he walks into, powerful, polarizing, unmistakable, Miles Robbins carries a different kind of legacy, not of awards or activism, but of transformation. He didn't break from the Sarandon name, he mutated it, and in doing so, he became something Hollywood rarely allows: a son who didn't follow or flee the script. He rewrote it entirely. 3 children. One fought to step out of the frame, One turned the lens around, and one reshaped the role entirely. Ava tried to own the spotlight but had to wrestle it away from her mother's shadow. Jack stayed behind the camera, cutting through noise with quiet precision. And Miles, the wild card, defied every mold, turning legacy into something fluid, unruly, and completely his own. Each lived a different version of what it meant to be a Sarandon, not just by name, but by resistance. Their mother gave the world fierce performances and louder convictions. They gave her something deeper: perspective, independence, and the freedom to be a legend without apology. If you found this story meaningful and want more deep dives into the hidden lives behind America's most complex public figures, subscribe to After the Fame. Your support helps reveal the stories fame forgets. Thanks for listening.